If you're watching this, you've probably dealt with an entitled neighbor or a nightmare HOA at some point. But I wager my story takes the cake and eats it too, right in front of your illegally parked car. My particular HOA menace, let's call her Calamity Kate, decided my private ranch land was her personal shortcut and express lane, saving her a whole 3 minutes on her commute. She was about to learn that trespassing on my property meant navigating a field of carefully planned, entirely legal landmines designed specifically for her. My ranch, Whispering Pines, wasn't just property, it was a sanctuary, a legacy passed down through generations, sprawling over acres of rolling hills, ancient oaks, and pasture land, where my cattle grazed peacefully. It was my lifeblood, the place I worked from sunup to sundown, and the place I found solace. Then the new executive housing development sprang up like a series of fungal growths on my western border. A development governed by an HOA with an iron fist, and apparently a complete disregard for existing property lines or rural common sense. And with that development came Calamity Kate. My first encounter was innocuous enough, or so I thought. I was mending a fence line near the new development's edge, a good quarter mile inside my own property markers, when a shiny, oversized SUV, the color of aggression, a sort of angry crimson, bumped off the paved cul-de-sac of the HOA and onto my access track. This track was strictly for my use, for moving equipment, checking on livestock. It was clearly part of my working ranch. Kate, a woman who looked like she'd demand to speak to the manager of the Sunrise, stopped beside me, window gliding down with an expensive hum. "Is this track a through road?" she'd asked. Not a hint of politeness, more like an interrogation. I'd politely explained, "No, ma'am, this is private property, my ranch land. The main road is back the way you came." She'd given me a look that could curdle fresh milk, a dismissive little humph, and then, to my utter disbelief, she'd simply driven on, bouncing along my track as if I hadn't spoken, as if my words were mere suggestions. She had no intention of following. I stood there, wrench in hand, dust settling around my boots, thinking, well, that was outrageously rude, but surely a one-off. How naive I was. That first incursion was merely the scouting mission for a full-blown invasion of my peace and property. The track she'd chosen exited onto another county road on the far side of my land, a route that, admittedly, if you didn't own the land and didn't care about property rights, might shave a few minutes off a trip to town. For Kate, this minor convenience apparently outweighed any legal or ethical considerations. The problem wasn't just the isolated incident, it was the precedent it set in her mind. Over the next few weeks, I saw her crimson SUV using my track with increasing regularity. Morning, noon, sometimes even evening. It wasn't just an occasional shortcut, it was her established route. The second part of this ordeal began with Kate not just trespassing, but doing so with an air of belligerent ownership, as if the tire tracks her ridiculously oversized SUV was carving into my pasture were somehow granting her squatter's rights. I tried the simple, neighborly approach first. I put up a sturdy, private property, no trespassing sign, large and unambiguous, right at the point where she usually entered my land. I even added a smaller, more polite, agricultural access-only sign beneath it. I figured, clear signage, problem solved. That sign lasted precisely 2 days. On the third morning, it was gone. Not knocked down, not vandalized in place, vanished. I found it later, tossed into a ditch half a mile away, clearly run over a few times for good measure, judging by the tire marks embedded in the faded paint. That told me everything I needed to know about Kate's respect for boundaries. She had none. My next step was to wait for her. I parked my old farm truck near the entrance one morning, timing it with her usual commute. Sure enough, her crimson behemoth appeared. I flagged her down, stepping out. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "we need to talk about this. You can't keep driving through here. This is private land, and it's an active ranch. It's dangerous for you, for my livestock, and you're damaging my property." Calamity Kate, true to her emerging persona, didn't even have the courtesy to fully open her window. Through the tinted glass, I saw her impeccably coiffed hair and a face that looked like it had been perpetually disappointed by the world. "I've been using this road for weeks," she declared, her voice tight with indignation. "It's clearly a track that's been here for ages. It's an established right-of-way." I could feel the anger starting to simmer. "It's a track I use for my tractor, not a public thoroughfare. It's been here because my family has worked this land for 70 years. Your weeks of trespassing don't establish anything but your disregard for the law." She then actually had the gall to say, "Well, the HOA president, Mr. Henderson, said it looked like an access road we could probably use. It's much more convenient for several of us." This was a new, infuriating development. She wasn't just a rogue agent of entitlement. She was potentially mobilizing others, or at least using the HOA as a shield. "Mr. Henderson doesn't own this land, I do," I replied, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "And neither he nor the HOA has any right to grant anyone access to my property. The next time I see you or anyone else from that development on this track, I'll be calling the sheriff." Her response was a scoff. "Don't threaten me. This is a community matter. You're being very unneighborly, hoarding all this land." She then gunned her engine, swerved around my truck, leaving me in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes, her tires spinning defiantly on my grass. The audacity was breathtaking. Unneighborly? Hoarding land? I was maintaining a working ranch, a green space that probably increased their damn property values, and she was accusing me of being the problem for not wanting my land turned into a public highway. I immediately called the HOA president, a man named Henderson, whom I'd never met. His response was infuriatingly blasé. "Oh, Mrs. Davis," he said, sounding like I was interrupting something far more important. "Yes, Karen mentioned something about a track. Look, we're all new here, just trying to settle in. Perhaps there's some misunderstanding about the old access routes." I explained, firmly but politely, that there was no misunderstanding. It was my land, clearly marked, and her residents were trespassing. He hummed and hawed, promised to look into it and have a word, but the tone was dismissive. He clearly saw me, the established landowner, as the nuisance, not his rule-breaking resident. True to my word, the next time I saw Kate's SUV, which was the very next day, I called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, took my statement, looked at my property markers, and then went to have a chat with Kate. I watched from a distance. The deputy was with her for maybe 10 minutes. Kate did a lot of gesturing. Then the deputy left, and Kate, after waiting for his car to disappear, got back in her SUV and drove right across my land again, this time with a smirk that I could practically feel from 200 yards away. The deputy called me back later. "Ma'am," he said, sounding tired, "I spoke with Mrs. Davis. She claims there's an implied easement and that she's seen county vehicles use that track. A flat-out lie. County vehicles use the county road, like normal people. She also said you threatened her." I explained the situation, the lack of any easement, the history of the track. But I could tell it was becoming a he said, she said situation for them, and trespass, while illegal, was low on their priority list unless there was a clear and present danger or significant damage. And Kate was smart enough, for now, to just drive through, not yet, to start tearing things up maliciously. The tire ruts were getting deeper, though, especially after a rain. It was becoming a muddy scar across what was once pristine pasture. I knew then that polite requests and standard legal channels were failing. Calamity Kate, bolstered by her own arrogance and the HOA's tacit approval, felt untouchable. She was a neighborhood dictator in the making, and my ranch was her first conquest. The frustration was immense, a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. My peaceful existence was being eroded, one unauthorized drive at a time. This wasn't just about a strip of land, it was about the principle of the thing, about defending my home and my livelihood from arrogant encroachment. If I let this go, what would be next? Would they decide my pond looked like a good community swimming pool? Would my barn become overflow parking for their Tupperware parties? The thought spurred a new kind of resolve. If Kate wanted to treat my ranch like hostile territory, then perhaps I needed to start treating her like an unwelcome combatant. The idea of landmines started as a dark joke in my head, but the more I fumed, the more I considered what kind of legal, non-lethal, but extremely persuasive deterrence I could implement. She had declared war on my peace of mind. She just didn't know I was about to deploy a very creative arsenal. My decision to fight back more concertedly wasn't made in a flash of anger, but rather as a slow burn of indignation reached its ignition point. Calamity Kate and her entitled assumptions about my property had pushed me from polite requests to genuine frustration, and now into a phase of meticulous, cold, calculated planning. If the law, in its immediate application by a tired deputy, wasn't going to provide swift relief, then I would have to use the full extent of my rights as a property owner to make her incursion so unpleasant, so inconvenient, so potentially costly for her, that she'd finally understand the meaning of private property. This wasn't just about Kate anymore. It was about setting a precedent. The HOA president, Henderson, had been utterly useless. His vague promises to look into it, clearly translating to, I don't care, as long as it's not my problem. I realized I needed to arm myself, not with weapons, but with knowledge and a strategic plan. My first port of call was my dear friend and neighbor, old Jedediah, a retired surveyor who knew every nook, cranny, and property law quirk in the county. Jed had lived here his whole life, and had seen his share of boundary disputes and entitled newcomers. I laid out the whole sorry tale over coffee in his dusty, map-filled office. He listened patiently, his weathered face occasionally tightening with disapproval as I recounted Kate's audacious statements and Henderson's apathy. When I finished, he took a long sip of coffee. Sounds like you got yourself a classic case of new money entitlement syndrome, compounded by HOA delusion of grandeur, he grunted. They buy these little ticky-tacky boxes, get a fancy rulebook for their postage stamp lawns, and suddenly think they own the whole county. Jed confirmed what I already suspected. My property lines were sacrosanct. There was no implied easement, and Kate's claims were pure bluster. First things first, he said, pulling out a large plat map of my ranch, its lines faded but precise. Let's re-verify every single marker. Get fresh stakes, bright paint. Make it impossible to ignore. Then, we talk strategy for making that track of yours decidedly less convenient. We spent the next weekend walking my western boundary, the one abutting the HOA. Jed, with his ancient but perfectly calibrated transit and rod, confirmed every survey pin, replacing old markers with bright orange steel posts pounded deep into the earth. We even put up new, larger, private property signs at more frequent intervals, this time bolting them to the steel posts. I figured Kate might think twice about trying to remove a sign that required a socket wrench and serious effort, especially if she risked being seen. During this process, Jed made an interesting observation. You know, he said, squinting at the developing ruts from Kate's SUV. Her vehicle, one of those big, low-profile tire jobs, right? Not built for real off-roading. More for looking intimidating at the mall. A seed of an idea began to sprout. What if Kate's convenient shortcut became inconveniently rough? What if it became a place where her shiny status symbol might suffer actual, physical indignity? The legal aspect was paramount. Jed emphasized, whatever you do on your land, it has to be demonstrably for agricultural purposes or property management. And if it could even remotely be considered a hazard, you signpost it like crazy. Warning signs are your best friends. My next visit was to a lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Albright who specialized in rural property rights. I wanted to understand the exact letter of the law regarding modifying my own land in a way that might deter trespassers, and what liabilities I might face if, say, Kate's precious SUV bottomed out or got a flat tire due to a naturally occurring obstacle on my private agricultural access road. Ms. Albright was grimly amused by the story of Calamity Kate. Oh, I've dealt with her type, she said, a slight smile playing on her lips. They think HOA bylaws trump state and federal law. They're often very surprised when they find out they don't. She confirmed that I had every right to modify my land for my purposes. I could till it, grade it, dig ditches for drainage, place rocks to prevent erosion or direct water flow, plant whatever I wanted. As long as I wasn't creating a deliberate trap with malicious intent to injure a person, which was never my goal, and as long as any potentially hazardous areas for vehicles were clearly on my private land and, ideally, warned about, I was well within my rights. The phrase, clear and unambiguous signage, became my new mantra. If she chooses to ignore multiple, clear warnings and drives onto your modified private land, any damage she incurs is likely her own responsibility, especially given her history of trespassing. Albright concluded, advising me to document everything: the state of the land before, every warning given, every act of trespassing, and every modification I made. Photographs, videos, registered letters if you have to. Build a fortress of evidence. So, armed with fresh survey lines, legal advice, and Jed's practical wisdom, I began to design my landmines. Not explosive devices, of course, but a series of strategically implemented inconveniences, perfectly legal and devastatingly effective. The key was to make the path not just bumpy, but actively hostile to a low-clearance, street tire-equipped SUV, while still being navigable by my own farm equipment. I studied the path Kate used. It was already degrading into two deep ruts with a high center. My plan was to accentuate these features, to make them truly treacherous. My old disc harrow, usually reserved for preparing fields for seeding, was about to get a new, more creative deployment. The mental image of Kate's crimson SUV, struggling and scraping, brought the first genuine smile to my face in weeks. The research phase wasn't just about legalities and practicalities. It was also about stealing my own resolve. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing you're fighting back intelligently, using the system and your own resources against those who abuse them. Calamity Kate had mistaken my initial politeness for weakness. She was about to learn that this rancher had very deep roots and was not afraid to cultivate a bit of thorny resistance. The thought of her impending frustration was a powerful motivator. She wanted a shortcut? I was going to give her a lesson in taking the long way around, a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The implementation of Operation Cease and Desist Kate, as I'd started calling it in my head, was undertaken with the precision of a military campaign, albeit one fought with agricultural implements and horticultural spite, rather than actual armaments. The beauty of it, I thought, was that everything I did was perfectly justifiable as ranch maintenance and land improvement. It just so happened that these improvements would make Kate's little joyrides utterly miserable. First, I put up even more signs, not just private property, but warning, uneven terrain ahead, caution, agricultural operations in progress, ranch access only, not a through road, and my personal favorite, warning, risk of vehicle damage. Proceed at your own peril, but you shouldn't be proceeding at all because this is private property. I had these professionally made, metal, highly visible, and I posted them at the exact spot where she always entered, and then again about 20 feet in. You couldn't miss them unless you were deliberately choosing to be blind, which, in Kate's case, was a distinct possibility. Next came the active landscaping. Jed had pointed out that Kate's SUV likely had low-profile tires and not much ground clearance. My old heavy-duty disc harrow was perfect for this. I hitched it to my most powerful tractor and drove it very slowly along the illicit track Kate had created, but I set the discs deep, really deep. This didn't just break up the compacted soil. It created a series of pronounced ridges and furrows, almost like a newly plowed field but more aggressive. It was no longer a relatively smooth pair of ruts. It was a corrugated nightmare. I imagined her trying to navigate that, the suspension on her precious SUV groaning, the bottom scraping. For my tractor, with its high clearance and rugged tires, it was a minor bump. For her, it would be a jarring, bone-rattling ordeal. Then, along the edges of this newly tilled track, and particularly in the center hump between where her tires would go, I strategically placed rocks. Not massive boulders that would look overtly aggressive, but a collection of jagged, fist-to-melon-sized rocks I'd cleared from other fields over the years. I half-buried some of them, just enough so their sharper edges were pointing skyward, like stony teeth waiting for an unsuspecting tire sidewall. These weren't obvious if you were just blasting through, but hit one at the wrong angle or try to straddle the now much higher and rock-infested center, and you'd risk some serious damage. Again, perfectly normal for a rustic ranch track, rocks work their way to the surface all the time, right? I was just helping them along in this specific area. Next came the water element. There was a slight depression along one section of the track. I subtly, very subtly, with a bit of careful work with a spade, deepened this depression and ensured that the runoff from a nearby stock tank's overflow pipe, which usually just dissipated into the pasture, now had a slight channel directing it squarely into this newly enhanced dip. With a little rain, or even just the regular tank overflow, this section would become a glorious vehicle-trapping mud bog. It wouldn't look like much when dry, but a day after some moisture? Treacherous. To add a biological warfare component, I decided to relocate one of my muck heaps. Every ranch has them, piles of manure, old hay, and bedding slowly composting down. I chose a particularly fragrant and well-aged specimen, and using my front-end loader, I spread a thick, viscous layer of it across a 50-foot section of the track, just beyond the new mud bog. Not only would it be disgustingly messy to drive through, but the smell, oh, the glorious, authentic smell of a working ranch, would surely permeate her climate-controlled cabin for days. If she got stuck in the mud bog first, she'd have to wade through the muck heap to try and get out. The mental imagery was delightful. The final touch, and perhaps my favorite, was the horticultural element. I researched fast-growing, incredibly thorny bushes. Honey locusts, with their vicious, multi-inch thorns, came to mind, as did some particularly aggressive rose varieties bred for impenetrability. I couldn't plant mature specimens overnight, but I could plant a dense barrier of smaller, very hardy, very thorny saplings very close to the edges of the harrowed track. Particularly on the shoulders, she might try to use to avoid the roughest parts. Over time, these would grow into a living fence of pure pain for any vehicle trying to push through them. For now, their presence, combined with the other measures, added to the "this is not a road" aesthetic. Throughout this entire process, I took copious photographs and videos. Me with the tractor, the newly placed signs, the texture of the improved road surface, the carefully arranged rocks, the irrigation for the mud bog, the artful spreading of the muck. Each step documented, dated, and saved. Ms. Albright would be proud. It took the better part of a week, fitting it in around my actual ranch work. It was hard labor, but incredibly satisfying. Each drop of sweat felt like a tiny victory. I was reclaiming my land, not just passively hoping for the best, but actively defending it. The beauty of it all was its plausible deniability if viewed by someone unfamiliar with the backstory. To an outsider, it might just look like a particularly rough, somewhat neglected farm track undergoing some aggressive maintenance. But to Calamity Kate, it would be a gauntlet, an insult, a direct challenge to her entitlement. I made sure my own tractor and ATV could still navigate the path, albeit more slowly and carefully. This was crucial. It was still my access road. It was just no longer her shortcut. As I finished the last improvement, I stood back and surveyed my handiwork. The setting sun cast long shadows over the rugged, rock-strewn, muck-splashed, and deeply furrowed strip of land. It looked wonderfully, beautifully impassable for a luxury SUV. I felt a sense of profound, almost giddy anticipation. The landmines were planted. Now, all I had to do was wait for the inevitable detonation. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Kate wouldn't be able to resist trying her shortcut again. Her arrogance was far too predictable. The waiting period was filled with a nervous, almost electric anticipation. I kept a pair of binoculars handy and made more frequent trips to the western edge of my property than strictly necessary for ranch chores. I pictured the scene over and over in my mind. Calamity Kate's crimson SUV approaching with its usual arrogant speed, and then crunch, or perhaps a squelch, followed by furious spinning tires. I even set up a discreet trail camera, camouflaged in a dense oak tree overlooking the improved section of the track, hoping to capture the glorious moment for posterity and, of course, for Miss Albright's evidence file. Several days passed. I saw other HOA residents coming and going from their cul-de-sac, but no sign of Kate's vehicle venturing onto my land. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if perhaps she'd seen my improvements from afar, or if Mr. Henderson had actually, for once, done his job and warned her off. But then I remembered Kate's defining characteristic, an unshakable belief in her own rightness and an utter disdain for anyone else's. She wouldn't be deterred by mere visual changes. She'd have to experience the consequences directly. It was a Thursday morning, just after 8:30 a.m., her usual commute time. I was in my workshop, ostensibly sharpening mower blades, but my ears were tuned for the distinctive rumble of her engine. And then, there it was. The sound was faint at first, then grew louder. My heart began to thump a little faster. I grabbed the binoculars and hurried to a vantage point on a small rise that gave me a clear view of the track entrance, without being easily seen myself. Sure enough, the angry crimson SUV appeared at the end of the HOA cul-de-sac. It paused for a moment, just as it always did. I could imagine Kate, perhaps noticing the new array of warning signs, the visibly altered terrain. For a second, I thought she might turn back, but no. With a surge of acceleration that spoke volumes about her contempt, she turned sharply onto my land. She was committed. The show was about to begin. Even from a distance, I could see the SUV start to buck and bounce violently as it hit the first set of deep furrows I'd dissed in. The speed dropped dramatically. It was no longer gliding, it was lurching, like a ship in a heavy storm. I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Phase 1 of the gauntlet was proving effective. She navigated the corrugated section with much weaving and, I imagined, much cursing, the vehicle protesting with squeaks and groans I couldn't hear but could easily picture. Then she reached the rock-strewn part. I saw her try to swerve to avoid a particularly nasty-looking outcrop I'd so lovingly positioned. Her front passenger side tire seemed mounted. There was a horrible screeching sound that even I could faintly hear, and the SUV lurched sideways. I pumped my fist. "Gotcha," I muttered. She was clearly agitated now, the vehicle moving at a crawl. Then came the mud bog. From my vantage point, it just looked like a damp patch, but I knew its treacherous, gooey depths. She approached it slowly. Then, perhaps thinking a bit of momentum would see her through, she accelerated. "Bad move, Kate." The front wheels hit the soupy clay, dug in, and the rear wheels, finding no purchase, just spun uselessly, flinging clods of mud high into the air, splattering the sides of her precious vehicle. She was stuck, well and truly stuck. Her expensive crimson status symbol was now axle-deep in muck, tilted at a comical angle, with one tire visibly damaged from the rock encounter. I watched, fascinated, as the driver's door opened and Calamity Kate emerged. Even from this distance, I could sense the incandescent rage radiating from her. She stomped around the SUV, hands on hips, then seemed to be yelling at the car, or perhaps the universe in general. She tried to get back in and rock it free, but the tires just whined and dug deeper. Then she spotted the muck heap just ahead of her, the one she would have driven through if she hadn't been ensnared by the bog. Realization seemed to dawn on her that to even attempt to walk out for help towards the county road meant wading through an aromatic field of decomposing farm waste. I stayed put, observing. This was her mess, her creation. After about 10 minutes of fuming and frantic phone calls, probably to her husband, then a tow truck company, then maybe Henderson to complain, she evidently gave up on an immediate escape via the far side of my ranch. I saw her gaze turn back towards the HOA, towards the way she came in. now a ravaged landscape of her own making. She then began the ignominious retreat, on foot, picking her way gingerly back through the furrows and rocks. I decided it was time for my concerned neighbor appearance. I got in my old truck and drove, slowly and carefully, along the edge of the field, not using the track itself, until I was about 50 yards from her stranded vehicle. I got out. "Having a spot of bother there, Mrs. Davis?" I called out, my voice dripping with feigned sympathy. She whirled around, her face a mask of fury. You did this!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger first at her SUV, then at me. "This road was fine yesterday. You sabotaged it." I adopted an expression of mild surprise. "Sabotaged it?" "Ma'am, this is my private agricultural access track. I've been doing some land management, trying to improve drainage and reduce soil compaction from unauthorized vehicle use. As you can see from the multiple warning signs I posted, this area is clearly marked as hazardous and not a through road. You chose to ignore those warnings." "Warnings?" she sputtered. "You deliberately set a trap." "A trap?" I asked, feigning innocence. "I assure you, Mrs. Davis, those are rocks that have been part of this land for eons. The ground was tilled to prepare for a cover crop, and that wet spot? Well, that's just how the land drains here, especially after I cleared the old culvert. And as for that aroma," I gestured towards the muck heap, "that's prime organic fertilizer, part of our regenerative agriculture program. If you'd stuck to the paved county roads, you wouldn't be in this predicament. Did you happen to get a flat tire on one of those rocks I specifically warned about keeping clear of?" Shame. Her face was purple. "I'm calling the sheriff. I'm calling my lawyer. You'll pay for this." The sheriff did indeed arrive, along with a tow truck that Kate had presumably called. The tow truck driver took one look at the situation, shook his head, and said it would be an expensive and difficult extraction, especially given the terrain and the risk of further damage to her SUV. Deputy Miller, the same one who'd spoken to her before, listened patiently to Kate's tirade about booby traps and my malicious destruction of her shortcut. Then he walked over to me. I showed him the fresh, highly visible signs. I showed him the trail camera photos I'd already printed, showing Kate driving right past the signs. I explained the agricultural work I'd undertaken. "Deputy," I said calmly, "this is my land." I warned her repeatedly, verbally, and with signage. She chose to trespass, again, and unfortunately, encountered the natural and man-made contours of a working ranch track that is not designed for commuter vehicles. Deputy Miller looked at the signs, at the track, at Kate's SUV, then back at me. He sighed. "Ma'am," he said to Kate, "this appears to be private property, and it's clearly signed. Mr. Jameson has the right to manage his land as he sees fit for his agricultural business. Driving a vehicle like yours on an unimproved farm track, especially after being warned, carries inherent risks." Kate looked like she was about to explode. The tow truck driver finally managed, after much maneuvering and the use of winches and planks, to haul her SUV out of the mud, dragging it backwards over the ruts and rocks, adding new scrapes and scars to its already battered undercarriage and sides. The bill, I later heard through the grapevine, was astronomical. As her ruined vehicle was finally winched onto the flatbed, Kate shot me a look of pure venom. "This isn't over?" she hissed. "Oh, I rather think it is, Mrs. Davis," I replied, smiling sweetly. "At least, your use of my shortcut is." The detonation had been every bit as satisfying as I'd hoped, and the sight of her crimson chariot of arrogance, battered, mud-caked, and defeated, was a masterpiece of retaliatory landscaping. The immediate aftermath of Calamity Kate's disastrous attempt to conquer my newly fortified ranch track was, to put it mildly, intensely gratifying. The sight of her mud-encrusted, dented, and thoroughly humbled crimson SUV being ignominiously hauled away on a flatbed was a picture I'll cherish for years to come. But the ripples of her defeat spread further than just her own considerable inconvenience and expense. Word travels fast in small communities, and even faster in the gossipy confines of an HOA. The story of Kate's folly, as it quickly became known, was recounted with various embellishments, mostly painting her as an arrogant fool who got her just desserts. My trail camera footage, discreetly leaked to a couple of more reasonable HOA residents who had quietly expressed sympathy for my plight earlier, probably didn't hurt in shaping that narrative. The footage clearly showed her ignoring multiple large warning signs and then promptly getting her vehicle mangled and stuck. It was hard to play the victim when the evidence of your own culpability was so stark. Kate, true to her threat, did try to make it not over. She attempted to rally the HOA, specifically Mr. Henderson, the president, to take action against me. She apparently spun a wild tale of deliberate sabotage, booby traps, and me acting like a feudal lord, denying community access. Henderson, however, was suddenly much less cavalier. Perhaps the prospect of the HOA being dragged into a legal battle over one resident's blatant and repeated trespassing on well-marked private property, especially when that property owner was clearly prepared and documented, gave him pause. I heard he visited the site himself, saw my array of professional-looking warning signs, noted the obvious agricultural nature of my land modifications, and likely visualized the HOA's legal fees skyrocketing. Ms. Albright, my lawyer, also sent Henderson a polite but firm letter, complete with photographs and a summary of Kate's history of trespassing, reiterating my rights as a landowner and cautioning the HOA against supporting or encouraging any further incursions or harassment. The letter also gently hinted at a potential countersuit for damages to my property, the ruts, the vanished sign, and harassment if the behavior continued. That letter, I believe, was the true final landmine that detonated under the HOA's collective enthusiasm for Kate's cause. Suddenly, Henderson was all about respecting private property rights. He issued a memo to all HOA residents, explicitly stating that the track on my land was private, not to be used, and that any damage incurred by trespassing would be the sole responsibility of the trespasser. He didn't name Kate, but everyone knew who it was about. Kate also apparently tried to sue me directly for the damage to her vehicle. Miss Albright practically cackled when she told me. She filed a small claim suit alleging willful destruction of property and creation of a dangerous nuisance. My lawyer relayed. We'll be there, of course, with our mountain of evidence. The court appearance was a brief, almost comical affair. Kate, looking stern and self-righteous, presented her case with a series of grainy photos of her damaged SUV. I, guided by Miss Albright, presented my clear, dated photos of the land before and after my improvements, copies of the warning letters, photos of the numerous signs, and the key trail camera footage showing Kate driving past the warnings. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she'd heard every excuse in the book, listened patiently, then looked at Kate. "Ma'am," she said, "you drove past multiple clearly visible no trespassing and warning uneven terrain signs onto private agricultural land. You proceeded onto a track that was visibly not a maintained road. What outcome did you expect?" Kate spluttered something about implied easements and community spirit. The judge dismissed her case with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile. She even made a comment about frivolous litigation and advised Kate to consult a map next time she felt the urge to take a shortcut. The look on Kate's face was priceless. That was the true end of her campaign against my ranch. She still lived in the HOA, of course, but I never saw her crimson SUV, or any other vehicle from the development, venture onto my land again. The track slowly began to recover. The thorny bushes I planted started to fill in, creating an even more formidable natural barrier. The muck heap composted down nicely. The rocks became part of the landscape. Peace, blessedly, returned to whispering pines. My cattle grazed undisturbed. I could mend my fences without bracing for a confrontation. The experience, though stressful, was ultimately empowering. It taught me that sometimes polite requests aren't enough. Sometimes you have to be willing to draw a firm line, not just on the ground, but in your actions. You have to be willing to plant your landmines, legally and metaphorically, to protect what's yours. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that you stood your ground, used your intellect and resources wisely, and beat an entitled bully at her own game, all while operating entirely within your rights. And every now and then, when I drive past that section of my land, I see the faint remnants of where Kate's SUV got stuck, a subtle indentation in the earth now overgrown with grass, and I smile. It's a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, especially when it's for your home, your peace, and your principles. If you're out there, dealing with your own calamity, Kate, remember this. Document everything, know your rights, get good advice, and don't be afraid to get a little creative with your defenses. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a charging bull is to build a really, really strong fence, maybe with a few well-placed surprises just on your side of it. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to deal with an HOA from hell or a neighbor who thought your property was theirs for the taking. I'd love to hear your stories.